My father raised his champagne glass, smiled at a room full of donors, and said, "This is my older son, the cautionary tale. Every family has one." People laughed, not because they were cruel, because they thought it was a joke. I smiled too. It was easier than explaining that he meant every word. Then the guest of honor stopped laughing. He looked at me for a long second, frowned like he was trying to place an old photograph, and quietly asked, "I'm sorry, did you just say your last name is Vale?" The room went strangely still. My father answered before I could. "Unfortunately." The man blinked once, then he stood up. That was the moment everything began to unravel, but none of us had any idea how many years had led to those few seconds. My name is Corwin Vale, and I grew up in the kind of town where every storefront had a history, and every family believed they knew everyone else's business. Ashford wasn't famous for anything spectacular. It had an old courthouse with ivy climbing its stone walls, a train depot that hadn't seen passengers in decades, and neighborhoods full of houses built long before anyone worried about modern floor plans. People stayed there because their parents had stayed there. My parents expected the same from me. The strange part is that I never wanted to leave. I just wanted to build something they couldn't imagine. Unfortunately, they decided what my future would look like long before I was old enough to disagree. Dad owned a successful insurance agency. Mom worked beside him. Their lives were organized, predictable, respected. My younger brother, Tavian, fit naturally into that world. He loved networking before he even knew what networking meant. At 15, he'd remember people's birthdays better than our parents did. At 17, he was organizing charity drives for school. Adults adored him. To be fair, so did I. Tavian wasn't arrogant, he simply knew how to make everyone feel important. Standing beside him often felt like standing beside a warm fireplace. People drifted toward him without realizing it. I never blamed him for that. Our parents, however, loved comparisons. Tavian understands people. Tavian thinks ahead. Tavian knows how to make opportunities. Then came the sentence I heard more times than I could count. Corwin works hard, but hard work isn't enough. At first, I believed they were trying to motivate me. Years later, I realized they had already decided who each son was supposed to become. No evidence would ever be enough to change those roles. The only person who refused to accept that script was my grandmother. Everyone called her Nana Elsbeth. She lived alone in a weathered Victorian house filled with clocks that rarely agreed on the time. Whenever I visited, she'd hand me a mug of tea before asking exactly one question. "What caught your eye this week?" Not "how's school," not "how are your grades." She wanted to know what fascinated me. Sometimes it was an old church window. Sometimes a cracked staircase in a century-old library. Sometimes decorative stone carved by people whose names nobody remembered anymore. She listened like those things mattered. One Saturday, when I was 16, she drove me to an abandoned textile mill on the edge of town. The building was falling apart. Broken windows, sagging roof, rust everywhere. Most people saw garbage. I stood there staring at the brickwork. "Look at that arch," I whispered. "What about it?" Nana asked. "They built it without steel." She smiled. "Most people notice what's broken. You notice what's survived." That sentence stayed with me. Years later, I'd write it on the first page of every company notebook I owned. Most people notice what's broken, notice what's survived. When graduation arrived, my parents expected one conversation: insurance, business school, eventually taking over the agency. Instead, I came home carrying brochures from a historic preservation program. Dad laughed, actually laughed. "I thought these were architecture schools. They're restoration programs." Mom frowned. "For museums? For historic buildings?" Silence. Dad leaned back. So you want to repair old houses? It's more than houses. What pays for that? Cities, universities, private owners, foundations? He exchanged a glance with Mom. It wasn't anger, it was disappointment mixed with confusion, the kind adults reserve for children who insist the moon is made of cheese. You've always liked old things, Mom said gently, but hobbies aren't careers. It's not a hobby. Dad folded the brochure. No son of mine is spending 4 years learning how to scrape paint off antique windows. I tried explaining. Historic restoration wasn't handyman work. It involved structural engineering, conservation science, specialized materials, documentation, craftsmanship. Entire teams dedicated years to preserving buildings people assumed would disappear forever. The more I explained, the less interested they became. Finally, Dad interrupted. So you'll be a laborer? No. A contractor? Not exactly. A repairman. I rubbed my forehead. It's restoration. He nodded slowly. Repairman. That word followed me for the next decade. College wasn't glamorous. While classmates spent weekends traveling, I spent mine volunteering on restoration projects just to learn. I cleaned limestone with toothbrushes, cataloged damaged wood, mixed lime mortar by hand because modern cement would slowly destroy older brick. Most people had never heard of lime mortar. I became obsessed with understanding why buildings survived hundreds of years. One professor changed my life. His name was Professor Arden Quill. Soft-spoken, always carrying notebooks held together with tape, he walked us through an abandoned courthouse one afternoon. Half the class complained about the dust. Professor Quill ran his hand along an old wooden railing. People think preservation is about saving buildings. He smiled. It isn't. It's about protecting memory. That landed somewhere deep inside me, because memories disappear much faster than stone. My parents visited campus exactly once. Dad looked around the workshop where students were carefully restoring stained glass. So this is what tuition bought. I introduced him to Professor Quill. The professor enthusiastically described restoration technology, laser scanning, material analysis, historical documentation. Dad listened politely. Then, while we walked back to the parking lot, he whispered, "He seems nice." Pause. For a repairman. I stopped correcting him after that, not because I agreed, because I realized he wasn't listening. After graduation, I didn't immediately launch a company. I carried equipment, measured moisture, swept floors, loaded trucks, spent freezing mornings inside abandoned churches, spent scorching afternoons on rooftops, learned from craftsmen who'd forgotten more than I knew. Some spoke very little. One mason named Burke taught me how to hear loose stone. He'd tap gently with his knuckle. Listen. I couldn't hear anything. Months later, I finally could. Tiny differences, tiny warnings. Buildings talked if you learned their language. No textbook could teach that. My parents never asked what I actually did. Instead, they'd ask, "So, still carrying ladders?" Or, "Found steady construction work yet?" If I tried explaining conservation planning or structural assessments, eyes glazed over. Conversation ended. Meanwhile, Tavian was thriving. He joined a nonprofit that connected local businesses with community projects. Within a few years, he became one of the youngest development directors in the region. He deserved it. He worked incredibly hard. He remembered names, solved problems calmly. People trusted him. I was proud of him. Unfortunately, our parents transformed every one of his accomplishments into another comparison. Tavian had dinner with the governor's office. Tavian organized another fundraiser. Tavian's picture was in the newspaper. Then came the inevitable glance toward me. And Corwin? Mom smiled politely. Still fixing things? Nana Elsbeth never asked about money. She asked better questions. What mistake taught you something? What surprised you? Who did you meet? When I admitted I worried I'd chosen the wrong path, she poured more tea. Did you help save something this month? Yes. Then sleep well. It doesn't pay much. Yet, she shrugged. Trees don't apologize for growing slowly. The company began almost by accident. A small historical society couldn't afford larger firms. They needed someone to stabilize an old railway station before winter. I wasn't the obvious choice. I was simply the only one willing to spend 2 weeks examining every beam before suggesting expensive replacements. Turns out, most beams didn't need replacing. They needed patience. The project came in under budget. The station reopened the following spring. One recommendation led to another, then another. I registered Vale Restoration Partners because I needed a name for invoices. At first, partners consisted of me and a pickup truck with one stubborn headlight. Money stayed tight, very tight. There were weeks I delayed paying myself so 2 carpenters could receive full paychecks. I lived in a 1-bedroom apartment above a bakery. Every morning smelled like fresh bread. Every evening smelled like old paperwork because I filled my tiny kitchen with blueprints. Friends bought homes. I bought moisture meters. Friends upgraded cars. I repaired mine. One winter, my truck heater died. I drove 3 hours wearing gloves. People see successful businesses years later. They rarely imagine the founder scraping ice off the inside of his windshield because replacing the heater meant delaying payroll. Dad assumed the company had failed within months. You can always come work with us. I'm okay. You don't have to pretend. I'm not pretending. He sighed. Pride is expensive. He genuinely believed he was rescuing me. I thanked him every time, and every time, I declined. The breakthrough arrived during my 8th year. Not because of luck, because of reputation. A university invited us to inspect a century-old observatory everyone else believed required demolition. My team spent 6 weeks documenting every crack before recommending targeted reinforcement instead of total replacement. The savings were enormous. More importantly, the observatory survived. Engineers from other states began calling. Architects recommended us. Foundations noticed. Suddenly, we weren't chasing projects. Projects found us. I hired historians, conservation architects, structural specialists, craftspeople who treated forgotten buildings like living relatives. Our office occupied an old warehouse we restored ourselves. We left one brick wall untouched. Visitors always asked why. Because perfection isn't history. History keeps its scars. I invited my parents to our open house. Mom said they already had dinner plans. Dad asked, "So business finally picked up?" "A little." "That's good. You deserve steady work." Neither came. Nana Elsbeth did. She walked slowly through every room, touched the exposed beams, read every plaque. Finally, she hugged me. "This building sounds happier." I laughed. "You hear buildings too?" "I hear you." Then she whispered something I'll never forget. "They never understood your dream because they kept translating it into theirs." Years passed. Our projects appeared in magazines I'd never bought. Industry conferences invited me to speak about conservation planning. I usually declined. I preferred job sites to stages. Recognition wasn't why I started. Saving places was. Ironically, the less I chased attention, the more attention arrived. Meanwhile, my family remained almost completely unaware. Not because I hid anything, because they never asked. If Mom called, conversation lasted 6 minutes. "How's work?" "Busy." "Still restoring buildings?" "Yes." "Stay safe. Love you. Bye." That was it. Then Tavian called one evening. "You'd better not say no." "I probably will." He laughed. "Our foundation's 10th anniversary gala." "I don't really do galas." "I know. which is exactly why Mom will panic if you don't come. That's not a selling point. It matters to me. Silence. Then he added softly, I want my brother there. That settled it. I'll come. Suit? I own one. You sound offended. I am. He laughed so hard he had to stop talking. The gala was held inside the restored Grand Ellery Hotel. Ironically, I'd spent nearly 18 months consulting on the preservation strategy for its ballroom ceiling. Nobody in my family knew. Walking inside felt strangely personal. I noticed details nobody else would. The repaired plaster medallions, the restored walnut paneling, the original brass railings polished instead of replaced. Hundreds of people admired the room without realizing how close it had once come to disappearing. I liked that. Good restoration isn't supposed to announce itself. It's supposed to let history breathe. Dad greeted me with a quick handshake. You clean up well. Thanks. Mom adjusted my tie without asking. I was worried you'd show up in work boots. I know how to read invitations. She smiled, though I couldn't tell if she was joking. Across the room, Tavian waved enthusiastically. He looked completely at ease, confident, happy, exactly where he belonged. I was genuinely glad for him. He'd built something meaningful too, different from mine, no less valuable. For a while, the evening felt pleasant, manageable. Then cocktails ended. People gathered around the head table. Name cards, donors, business leaders, local officials, and one nationally respected keynote speaker whose foundation had helped preserve historic landmarks across the country. I'd met him twice during professional conferences, never socially. I doubted he'd remember me. Dad leaned toward a couple seated nearby. You'll enjoy meeting my boys. He motioned toward Tavian first. This one's made us proud since he was little. Tavian looked embarrassed. Dad. Then my father placed a hand lightly against my shoulder. And this, he smiled with practiced charm, is our older son. Every family has a cautionary tale. Several guests chuckled politely. Dad continued. He means well, just never figured out a real profession. Someone asked what I did. Before I could answer, Mom smiled sympathetically. He repairs old buildings. Very hands-on. Dad lifted his glass. We keep telling him there's still time to join the family business. More laughter. Not loud, not malicious, just enough. I felt that familiar weight settle quietly across my shoulders, the same one I'd carried since I was 18. I wasn't angry, mostly tired. I glanced toward Tavian. He opened his mouth, closed it again, clearly unsure how to interrupt without making things worse. Then I heard a chair slide back. The keynote speaker had been studying me with a puzzled expression. He tilted his head. I'm sorry. His eyes narrowed slightly. Did you say your name is Corwin Vale? I nodded. Yes, sir. His expression changed completely. He looked from me to my parents and then back again. The room grew noticeably quieter. Finally, he asked one simple question. You're the founder of Vale Restoration Partners, aren't you? I didn't answer right away. Not because I was hiding anything, because suddenly 40 people were looking at me, and I knew that whatever I said next would change the evening. The ballroom had been humming with quiet conversations only seconds earlier. Now even the servers seemed to slow down. My father chuckled, waving one hand as though brushing away a misunderstanding. No, you've got the wrong fellow. The keynote speaker kept his eyes on me. Do I? I met his gaze. I'm Corwin Vale. His eyebrows lifted. And you founded Vale Restoration Partners. It wasn't really a question anymore. I nodded once. I did. The silence that followed felt heavier than any applause I'd ever heard. Dad laughed again, although it sounded thinner this time. Well, he owns a little restoration business. The speaker blinked. A little restoration business? He looks genuinely confused. I'm afraid I don't understand. Mom jumped in with a polite smile. He fixes old buildings. It's honest work. The speaker looked at her for a long second before slowly asking, "May I ask what you think Vale Restoration Partners does?" Dad answered confidently, "They renovate old houses." The man stared. Then he looked back at me as if silently asking permission. I simply gave a small shrug. He turned toward my parents. "I'm not sure whether to answer that question professionally or personally." Nobody laughed. He continued, "Professionally, they're considered one of the most respected historic restoration firms in the country." Someone at another table stopped talking. Another guest quietly lowered his wine glass. Dad smiled politely. "Well, that's certainly flattering." The speaker frowned. "I'm not flattering him." He paused. "I'm describing his company." People often imagine moments like that exploding all at once. They don't. They unfold inch by inch. Confusion always arrives before disbelief. A donor seated across from us leaned toward the speaker. "I'm sorry, are we talking about the same company that restored the Hawthorne Opera House?" The speaker nodded. "Yes." Another guest added, "And the Whitmore Observatory?" "Yes." Someone else spoke from farther down the table. "What about the Mercer Courthouse?" "The stabilization plan was theirs." My father looked around the table. He smiled again, but now it looked practiced. "Well, Corwin never mentioned any of that." I answered quietly, "You never asked." The words weren't sharp. They were simply true. Dad opened his mouth, closed it again. The keynote speaker extended his hand across the table. "I don't think we've formally met outside conferences." I shook it. "It's good to see you again." "You as well." He smiled warmly. "I was beginning to think I was losing my memory." Several guests looked back and forth between us. One woman, wearing a Museum Foundation badge, asked, "You two know each other?" He nodded. "We've served on preservation advisory panels together." Mom's head turned so quickly I heard her earrings click together. "Panels?" The speaker smiled. "Yes." He looked at me. "I still use one of your assessment models." I laughed softly. "I've improved it since then." "I hope so." He grinned. "It was making the rest of us look lazy." A ripple of genuine laughter spread across the room, very different from the laughter that had greeted my father's introduction. This laughter included me, not at me. Dad cleared his throat. "So, your company is doing well?" I took a sip of water before answering. "We've been fortunate." The speaker gently corrected me. "No, you've been exceptionally disciplined." He turned toward the guests. "I've watched firms twice their size chase publicity while Corwin quietly focused on quality." I felt heat creeping into my face. Praise had always made me uncomfortable. "I've had an excellent team." He smiled knowingly. "That's exactly what I expected you to say." One of Tavian's board members leaned toward me. "I'm embarrassed to admit I've heard of your company for years." He looked genuinely puzzled. "I had no idea you were Tavian's brother." Tavian laughed awkwardly. "Apparently neither did half the room." That finally broke some of the tension. Even Dad smiled, but it disappeared almost immediately, because another guest asked a question. "So, how many people work for your company now?" I answered honestly, "Just under 100. The woman blinked. "I'm sorry, did you say 100? 96 full-time." The table fell quiet again. Dad slowly turned toward me. "You employ 96 people?" "Currently." His expression suggested he wasn't questioning the number. He was questioning every conversation we'd ever had. I remembered Thanksgiving 3 years earlier. Dad had carved the turkey while asking, "So how many guys are helping you now?" "About 40. He'd nodded absent-mindedly. "Construction must be busy." That had been the end of the conversation, not because I'd hidden anything, because he'd already stopped listening. The keynote speaker seemed to notice the same realization crossing my father's face. He spoke carefully. I don't mean to intrude on family matters, he paused, but I assumed everyone here already knew. Mom quietly asked, Knew what? He looked almost uncomfortable. That your son's company has restored some of the country's most significant historic properties. Nobody spoke. He continued, The Grand Ellery Hotel? He gently tapped the ballroom table. This room wouldn't exist without their work. Every head instinctively looked upward. The restored ceiling glowed beneath crystal chandeliers. I couldn't help smiling, not because people were finally impressed, because after all these years, someone else had noticed the ceiling. One donor looked around in amazement. You restored this ballroom? I shook my head. My team restored it. I supervised part of the conservation planning. The keynote speaker chuckled. That's Corwin. If he painted the entire building himself, he smiled, he'd still tell you someone else held the ladder. Dad looked up again. His eyes moved slowly across the decorative plaster. You worked here? For 18 months. He frowned. This hotel closed for renovations. I know. You never said. I mentioned traveling here several times. I thought... He stopped. You thought what? That you were working construction. I nodded gently. I know. Dinner was served. Normally, that would have shifted everyone's attention. Instead, conversations kept circling back toward me. Not because I was trying to become the center of attention, because curiosity had replaced assumption. A woman from a university preservation office asked, What first got you interested? I smiled. Old buildings. She laughed. No. I mean, really. I thought about Nana, about dusty afternoons, about forgotten places. I liked the idea that something people considered finished could still have another chapter. She smiled thoughtfully. I like that. Across the table, my mother had barely touched her food. She kept watching me the way someone studies a familiar photograph that suddenly seems different. Finally, she asked, When did all this happen? I looked at her. It didn't. She frowned. What do you mean? It happened slowly. A project, then another, for about 12 years. She whispered, 12 years? There wasn't accusation in her voice, only confusion, as though she'd misplaced an entire decade. Tavian finally spoke. I have a question. Everyone looked at him. He laughed. I honestly don't know the answer. He turned toward me. How many states have you worked in? I counted silently. 23. His fork stopped halfway to his mouth. I thought you mostly stayed around Ashford. I travel a lot. When? I smiled. The conferences you kept teasing me for, skipping family barbecues. His eyes widened. Oh. Then another memory landed. The times Dad kept saying... He stopped. I nodded. You work too much. He slowly leaned back. I thought you were repairing old churches. Sometimes. And universities. And theaters. And courthouses. And train stations. And libraries. He stared for another second before laughing softly. I really had no idea. I know. The keynote speaker stood to begin his scheduled address. Normally, Gala speeches followed predictable patterns. Thank sponsors, celebrate volunteers, discuss future goals. He walked to the podium, adjusted the microphone, then smiled toward Tavian. Before I begin, he glanced back toward my table. I'd like to thank your foundation for inviting me. Polite applause. He continued. I also owe an unexpected thank you to someone I wasn't expecting to see tonight. Every instinct in my body wished he'd move on. Instead, he looked directly at me. Mr. Corwin Vale. The room followed his gaze. I've spent much of my career advocating for preservation. He paused. People often assume that means preserving buildings. It doesn't. It's preserving stories. My chest tightened. Professor Quill had said almost those exact words years ago. The speaker continued. Every generation decides what deserves to survive. And every so often, he smiled slightly, someone comes along who quietly makes sure future generations inherit more than photographs. He wasn't exaggerating. He wasn't listing awards. He wasn't talking about revenue. He was talking about purpose. That mattered infinitely more. He spent only 2 minutes mentioning me. The remaining 25 minutes focused entirely on Tavian's foundation and its work. I appreciated that. It was Tavian's evening, not mine. When the applause ended, guests stood to mingle. Almost immediately, a line formed near our table. People wanted introductions, business cards, questions. I answered them briefly, then redirected attention toward my project managers whenever possible. They handled that restoration. Our lead conservator designed that solution. Our engineers deserve credit. It was the truth. No company reaches that size because one person works harder than everyone else. It grows because talented people choose to believe in the same mission. Dad remained unusually quiet. Finally, he asked, "Can we talk?" "Of course." He looked around. Somewhere private. Before I could answer, another guest approached. "Mr. Vale?" I turned. It was the chairman of a regional history trust. "I've been hoping to meet you." We spoke for less than 2 minutes. When I turned back, Dad had walked away. I found him standing alone beside one of the ballroom windows overlooking the city lights. For a while, neither of us spoke. Finally, he asked, "Why didn't you tell us?" His voice wasn't angry. It sounded tired. I answered honestly, "I did." He frowned. "No. You never told us," he gestured vaguely toward the ballroom, "all this." I leaned against the window. "Dad, how many times did you ask what I actually did?" He looked away. "I knew what you did. You thought you knew." Silence. I continued quietly. Every time I tried explaining, you translated it into something that made sense to you. You decided I repaired buildings. So eventually, I smiled sadly, I stopped correcting you. He stared out across the lights. "I don't remember that." "I do." His shoulders seemed smaller than they had earlier that evening. "You should have insisted." I shook my head. "I was 22. You were my father. I assumed, eventually, you'd become curious." He closed his eyes briefly. "I thought I understood your life." "I know." Footsteps echoed behind us. "Mom!" She stopped a few feet away. "I've been looking everywhere." Dad didn't turn around. She looked at me instead. Her eyes were wet, not crying, just holding back tears. "Can I ask you something?" "Anything." Her voice barely rose above a whisper. "Were we—" She stopped. Tried again. "Were we really that wrong about you?" The question hung between us, not because I didn't know the answer, because I knew how much it would hurt. I took a slow breath, then I answered with complete honesty. "You weren't wrong about my potential." I met her eyes. "You were wrong about who you thought I needed to become." She stood perfectly still, as though those words had reached somewhere years deeper than tonight. And before either of my parents could respond, a quiet voice behind us said, "I've been trying to tell both of you that for 15 years. We all turned at once. Nana Elsbeth had arrived. Nana Elsbeth didn't raise her voice. She never had to. At 83, she had discovered something most people never learned, that the quietest person in the room often carried the greatest authority. My parents turned toward her almost in unison. Mom blinked first. "When did you get here?" Nana smiled. "Just in time, apparently." She rested one hand on her cane and looked around the hallway outside the ballroom. Music drifted faintly through the closed doors behind us, but out here, everything felt strangely still. The keynote speaker had unknowingly opened a door none of us could close again. Dad let out a slow breath. "I don't think now is the time." She tilted her head. "If not now, then when?" No one answered. She looked at me. "Corwin, would you give your old grandmother a few minutes alone with your parents?" I hesitated. She gave me the smallest smile. "I promise I'm not going to scold anyone." I almost laughed. That promise worries me. It should. For the first time all evening, even Dad managed a weak smile. "I'll be outside," I said. Nana nodded. "Good." The hotel overlooked the river that cut through downtown. I stepped onto the terrace where warm lights reflected across the water. People were scattered around small tables, talking about the gala, the charity auction, the weather, ordinary conversations that had nothing to do with my family. It was strangely comforting. Life kept moving. It always did. A few minutes later, the terrace door opened. Tavian joined me. He carried 2 glasses of sparkling water. "I figured you've had enough attention for one night." I accepted one. "That's accurate." For a while, we simply stood beside the railing. Finally, he shook his head. "I feel like I've known you my entire life." He laughed quietly. "And somehow I didn't." I looked toward the river. "You knew me." "No." I knew the version everyone described. His honesty caught me off guard. He continued. "I keep replaying conversations. Mom saying you were struggling, Dad calling your business temporary. I never questioned any of it." I shrugged. "You had your own life." Still, he looked frustrated. "I should have asked." I smiled. "You were busy building something meaningful too." He looked over. "Are you angry?" I considered the question. "I was." "When?" "Years ago." "What changed?" "I got tired." "Tired?" "Of hoping people would become curious." I took a sip of water. "So I stopped waiting." He nodded slowly. "I always thought you kept your distance. I thought you wanted distance. I didn't. You missed birthdays. I was restoring a courthouse in Montana. You skipped Christmas. I was stabilizing a church after a winter storm." His eyes widened. "I never knew." "I know." He leaned against the railing. "You know what's bothering me?" "What?" "I organized fundraising campaigns about preserving local history." He laughed at himself. "My own brother was helping preserve national history." "You'd think that would have come up." "It probably should have." We both laughed. Not because it was funny, because sometimes laughter is the only thing that fits when you're looking at years you can't get back. The terrace door opened again. Mom stepped outside. She looked smaller somehow. Not physically, emotionally. She glanced at Tavian. "Would you mind giving us a minute?" He looked at me. I nodded. "It's okay." After he left, Mom stood beside me without speaking. The river kept flowing beneath us. Finally, she whispered, "I owe you an apology." I didn't interrupt. "I've been thinking about something you said. You translated my dream into yours." She swallowed. "I think that's exactly what I did." I stayed quiet. She looked out across the water. "When you were little," she smiled faintly, "you could spend an hour staring at an old building. I never understood why. I thought you'd outgrow it. When you didn't," she sighed, "I decided it couldn't possibly become your future." There it was. Not cruelty. Fear. Fear wearing the mask of certainty. "I wanted security for you." "I know." "I thought I was protecting you."
I know. Tears finally reached her eyes. But I wasn't listening. No. I heard words. She shook her head. I never heard your heart. That one almost broke me, because it was true, and because she finally understood it herself. Dad joined us a few minutes later. He looked exhausted. He had removed his jacket and loosened his tie. I couldn't remember the last time I'd seen him look uncertain. He stopped a few feet away. "I've been talking with your grandmother." I smiled. "How'd that go?" He let out a dry laugh. "I lost. Nana doesn't usually keep score." "Oh." He looked at me. "She does." We both smiled. Then his expression became serious again. "I owe you more than an apology." I waited.
"I owe you honesty." He rubbed one hand across his forehead. "My father measured everything by stability. He survived layoffs, recessions, hard years. He taught me one lesson: never gamble with your future. I believed anything unfamiliar was a gamble." His eyes met mine. "So when you described restoration," he shook his head, "I didn't hear opportunity. I heard risk. I decided you were making a mistake. And after I decided that," his voice became quieter, "I only noticed evidence that proved I was right. Confirmation bias." He didn't use the phrase. He didn't need to. "I should have visited your work. Yes. I should have asked questions. Yes. I should have listened. Yes." He looked down. "I'm sorry." There wasn't anything dramatic about it. No grand speech, no excuses. Just one man admitting he'd been wrong. It mattered, but it didn't erase 12 years. Over the next hour, the gala slowly wound down. People said their goodbyes. Volunteers stacked auction materials. Staff cleared tables. Dozens of guests stopped to shake my hand before leaving. Several asked about future preservation projects. Others thanked Tavian for the evening. I noticed something that made me smile. The people who seemed most impressed by my work spent even longer talking with my brother, because they recognized what I'd always known. His work mattered too. Different mission, same purpose: helping communities keep what mattered. As we walked toward the parking area, Dad suddenly stopped beside the hotel entrance. He looked back at the building. "You really helped save this place." "Our team did." He smiled. "There you go again." "What?" "Always saying our team." "Because it's true." He nodded slowly. "I think—" He paused. "That's one of the things I misunderstood. I assumed success changed people." He looked at me. "It doesn't seem to have changed you." I thought about that. It did. How? It made me realize success doesn't fix old hurts. It just gives you choices. What kind of choices? You get to decide whether to stay bitter. He looked away. And what? I decided I didn't want to. Life after the gala wasn't magically different. Real life rarely works that way. Mom didn't suddenly understand historic preservation. Dad didn't wake up speaking the language of conservation. Relationships don't heal because of one emotional evening. They heal because of hundreds of ordinary ones afterward. Sometimes, if everyone chooses to keep showing up. A month later, Dad called. "Are you working tomorrow?" "Always." "Can I visit?" I almost asked why. Instead, I simply said, "Of course." He arrived wearing jeans I had never seen him wear before, clearly purchased for the occasion. My office manager tried very hard not to smile. I gave him a tour, not the polished presentation visitors usually received, the real one. Drafting tables, material testing, archive rooms, workshops, project meetings, engineers arguing politely over structural drawings, craftspeople repairing carved wood by hand. Dad watched everything. He asked questions, lots of them. Some were surprisingly thoughtful. Others revealed just how little he knew.
I answered every one. Near the end of the tour, we stopped inside our materials laboratory. He picked up 2 pieces of mortar. They look identical. They aren't. How can you tell? I handed him a magnifying lens. He spent nearly 2 minutes studying them. Finally, he looked up. I still can't. I smiled. I couldn't either. 12 years ago. Something shifted in his expression. Not guilt, respect. He was finally seeing how much I'd had to learn. Mom visited a week later. She spent most of her time talking with employees instead of me. I overheard her asking one young architect, "How long have you worked here?" 5 years. "What's Corwin like as a boss?" The woman laughed. "He still apologizes when meetings run 2 minutes late." Mom smiled. "He did that as a child, too." For the first time in years, I heard pride in her voice. Not because of what I'd built, because of who I'd become. That meant more.
Tavian and I started having breakfast once a month. No agendas, no family politics, just brothers catching up on the years we'd accidentally skipped. One morning, he admitted something. "I used to think you didn't need anybody." "Why? You never complained." "I complained. Not to us." I stirred my coffee. "I stopped because it never changed anything." He nodded. "Fair." Then he smiled. "I'd like to know what you're working on now." I pulled out my phone and showed him photographs of a 19th century lighthouse. For the next 45 minutes, he asked more questions than anyone in my family had asked in the previous decade. It felt nice, simple, natural, like we'd finally started the conversation we should have had years earlier. The biggest surprise came from Nana. She invited all of us to her house one Sunday. When we arrived, every clock had been taken off the walls. Dad looked around in confusion. "Where'd they go?" She smiled. "I donated most of them." "You loved those clocks." "I did." "So why?" She looked around the room. "They reminded me to count time." She glanced at all of us. "I'd rather spend it." Nobody argued. After lunch, she asked me to help carry one last clock upstairs. It was the oldest one she owned, the same grandfather clock I admired as a little boy. She rested her hand against the polished wood. "You know why I kept this one?" I shook my head. "Because it doesn't keep perfect time." I laughed. "That's an odd reason. It loses 3 minutes every day." She smiled. "So every evening," she gently touched the pendulum, "someone has to care enough to wind it." I looked at her. She looked back. Families are like that. If nobody chooses to tend them, she shrugged softly, they slowly fall behind. I understood. She wasn't telling me to forget the past. She wasn't asking me to erase boundaries. She was reminding me that healthy relationships require intentional care from everyone, not just one person. A year after the gala, our company completed another major restoration. The ribbon cutting drew local officials, historians, donors, and reporters. Dad and Mom stood quietly in the crowd, not in the front, not asking for recognition, just watching. After the ceremony, a reporter approached Dad. "You're Corwin Vale's father, right?" Dad nodded. The reporter smiled. "You must be incredibly proud." He looked toward me across the courtyard. Then he answered with a sentence I never expected to hear. "I'm proud of the man he became." He paused, and grateful he became him anyway. He didn't mention the company or the awards or the projects, just the man. For me, that was enough. As everyone began drifting toward the restored building, I lingered for a moment at the entrance. I ran my hand across the original stonework. Weathered, scarred, still standing. It reminded me of something Professor Quill had said all those years ago. People think preservation is about saving buildings. It isn't. It's about protecting memory.
I used to believe my greatest accomplishment was helping restore places that history almost lost. Now, I think it was something quieter. I learned that protecting the future doesn't always mean rebuilding what was broken. Sometimes it means refusing to let bitterness become the foundation of what comes next. And that's the kind of restoration no blueprint can teach.
If this story meant something to you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. What parts stayed with you the most, and what would you have done if you were in Corwin's place? Leave your thoughts in the comments. I read as many as I can. And if you enjoy emotional stories about perseverance, family, and earning respect through quiet determination, don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you won't miss the next story. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.